Prepare yourself for one of the most devastating family revelations ever uncovered, a discovery that would shatter everything a son believed about his father, his family, and the very foundation of his childhood home. This is the true story of a veteran who returned to inherit his father's Iowa farm after 20 years of military service, only to have his loyal German shepherd unearth evidence of crime so horrific that 3 generations of his family had conspired to keep them buried. What began as a homecoming would become a reckoning with evil that wore a familiar face and answered to Dad. Before we delve into this extraordinary tale of family secrets and impossible choices, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another incredible story of hidden truths that destroy everything we thought we knew about the people we loved. Now let's return to the farm, where childhood memories would collide with unspeakable reality. Part 1. The Return. The satellite phone's shrill ring cut through the pre-dawn darkness of Bagram Airfield like a blade, jarring Master Sergeant Michael James Hartley from the restless half-sleep that passed for rest in Afghanistan. October 15th, 2023, 03:07 hours local time. After 20 years in the United States Army, Michael's body had developed an automatic response to middle-of-the-night calls. Instant alertness tempered with the cold dread that came from knowing such calls never brought good news. He'd received 3 such calls in his military career: when his mother died in that car accident in California when he was 17, when his squad leader Martinez had been killed in an IED attack in Fallujah, and when his previous military working dog Brutus had succumbed to injuries after saving Michael's life in Helmand province. This would be the 4th. Michael fumbled for the phone in the darkness of his CHU, containerized housing unit, the military's euphemism for a glorified shipping container that served as home for deployed soldiers. Beside him, sprawled across the narrow strip of floor between the bed and the wall, Ranger stirred. The German shepherd's ears immediately perked to attention, his dark eyes reflecting the green glow of Michael's watch. Even in sleep, the dog maintained vigilance, a trait that had saved both their lives more times than Michael could count. "Hartley," Michael answered, his voice rough from the Afghan dust that coated everything despite the air filters. "Michael, this is Margaret Phillips from Phillips, Henderson and Associates in Cedar Rapids." The woman's voice carried that particular tone of professional sympathy that lawyers perfected when delivering bad news. The satellite delay made her words seem to echo from another world, which Michael supposed they were. Iowa might as well have been another planet from this forward operating base in Afghanistan. "Mr. Hartley, I'm calling about your father. I'm afraid Robert passed away this afternoon, October 14th, at approximately 4:30 p.m. Central Time. He was working in the barn when he suffered what appears to have been a massive coronary event. The neighbor, Jim Henderson, found him when he didn't answer his phone for their weekly chess game. The paramedics said it would have been very quick. He wouldn't have suffered." Michael sat on the edge of his bunk, his feet finding the gritty floor, processing the information with the emotional compartmentalization that 20 years of combat had taught him. Robert Allen Hartley, 71 years old, 3rd-generation owner of Hartley Farm, decorated Vietnam veteran, father, though that last designation came with complications that Michael had spent 2 decades avoiding, was dead. The woman continued talking, her words flowing through legal necessities and practical arrangements, but Michael's mind had already begun its retreat into the analytical coldness that had kept him functional through 6 deployments, through watching friends die, through losing parts of himself, both literal and metaphorical, to this endless war. His left ear, damaged by the same IED that had taken his left leg below the knee, struggled to process her words through the static of the satellite connection and the perpetual ringing that had been his companion since that day in Helmand province 3 years ago. "Mr. Hartley, are you still there?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm here. You said he was in the barn." "That's correct. The Hendersons have been looking after things since yesterday. The funeral home needs instructions, and there are estate matters that require your attention. You're the sole beneficiary, Mr. Hartley. Despite the estrangement, your father left everything to you. The farm, the equipment, all assets. It's substantial, 640 acres of prime farmland, clear of debt. Current market value is approximately $8.2 million. Michael almost laughed at the irony. 20 years ago, he joined the army the day after high school graduation specifically to escape that farm, to avoid being trapped in the cycle of corn and soybeans that had claimed every Hartley male for 4 generations. He told his father he'd never come back, would never take over the farm, would rather die in a foreign desert than slowly suffocate in Iowa corn dust. Now, after 6 deployments, after actually nearly dying in a foreign desert multiple times, the farm was his anyway. "I'll need to arrange emergency leave," Michael said. "It might take a few days." "Of course, the funeral home can wait for your instructions. There's no rush on the estate matters, though you should know that several agricultural corporations have already expressed interest in purchasing the property if you decide to sell. Your father was apparently quite vocal about you having no interest in farming." And that sounded like Robert, making sure everyone knew his son had abandoned the family legacy, had chosen war over corn, had broken a chain that stretched back to 1878, when the first Michael Hartley had claimed that land under the Homestead Act. After ending the call, Michael sat in the darkness for a long moment, Ranger now fully awake and pressed against his leg, providing the grounding pressure that helped prevent the dissociation that sometimes accompanied emotional shocks. The dog was trained to detect the physiological changes that preceded Michael's seizures, another gift from the IED that had taken his leg, but his abilities went beyond medical alert. Ranger seemed to understand human emotional states with an almost supernatural intuition. "He's dead, boy," Michael said quietly, his hand finding the soft fur behind Ranger's ears. "The old man is finally dead." Ranger whined softly, a sound that could have meant anything but which Michael interpreted as understanding. The dog had never met Robert Hartley, but he knew the name, had heard it spoken in therapy sessions conducted via video call, had witnessed Michael's complex reactions to the monthly letters that arrived from Iowa. Letters Michael read, but never answered. The emergency leave process moved with unusual efficiency, possibly because Michael was on his final deployment before retirement, possibly because death of a parent was one of the few reasons the Army considered truly non-negotiable. Within 72 hours, Michael was on a C-17 transport to Ramstein Air Base in Germany, then on a commercial flight to Chicago O'Hare, Ranger secured in the cabin beside him with his service dog vest that opened doors and eliminated questions. The rental car agency at O'Hare tried to give him a compact sedan until they saw his prosthetic leg and Ranger, then quickly upgraded him to a full-size SUV without charge, one of the small benefits of visible service-connected disabilities. The drive from Chicago to Millerville, Iowa, took 4 hours and 37 minutes, according to the GPS. But each mile seemed to compress 20 years of deliberately suppressed memories into moments of startling clarity. He remembered this route in reverse, the Greyhound bus to Chicago, the morning after graduation, his father standing in the driveway as the taxi pulled away, not waving, just watching his only child leave with an expression Michael had never been able to interpret. Had it been disappointment, relief, resignation, or something else, something that Michael's 18-year-old mind couldn't have recognized, but which his 42-year-old mind, trained in intelligence analysis and human behavior assessment, might now understand? The landscape of Iowa in late October was a study in agricultural precision. Cornfields stretched to the horizon, most already harvested, their stubble-covered surfaces waiting for winter snow or spring plowing. Soybean fields created a patchwork of golden brown. Every few miles, a farmstead interrupted the geometric perfection, White house, red barn, silver grain silos catching the afternoon sun like monuments to American agricultural dominance. Michael had forgotten, or deliberately refused to remember, how beautiful it could be. The Afghanistan he'd known for the better part of 2 decades was all dust and rocks and mountains that hid death. Iraq had been urban warfare and desert heat that made Iowa's worst summer seem mild, but this, the gentle roll of land, the mathematical precision of section roads that created a grid Thomas Jefferson would have appreciated, the way the sky seemed impossibly vast without mountains to frame it. This was a different kind of beauty, one that hurt to look at because it was so wrapped up in what he'd rejected. Ranger seemed to sense they were entering significant territory. The dog, who had been sleeping for most of the drive, was now alert, nose working the air coming through the cracked window, processing the agricultural smells that were as foreign to him as they had once been familiar to Michael. Ranger had been whelped at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, trained at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, and deployed to Afghanistan at 2 years old. His world had been military bases and combat zones. This pastoral landscape was as alien to him as Mars. The GPS directed Michael through Millerville, the county seat that barely qualified as a town, with its population of 2,547, according to the welcome sign that hadn't changed since Michael was a child, though he knew from census data that the actual population had declined to less than 2,000. The economic center of Millerville was the 4-block main street that contained the essential services of rural life: bank, post office, hardware store, diner, bar, church, funeral home. The Dairy Queen, where Michael had worked summers in high school, was boarded up, a casualty of population decline and changing economics. People on the sidewalks turned to watch the unfamiliar SUV with government plates pass through town. Michael recognized some faces, aged 20 years, but still identifiable. Tom Richardson, who'd been the high school football coach and had never forgiven Michael for quitting the team's senior year. Janet Morrison from the bank, whose daughter Katie had been Michael's prom date, now probably married with kids of her own. Old man Thompson, who couldn't possibly still be alive, but apparently was, still sitting on the bench outside the barbershop that had closed a decade ago, according to the dusty windows. They knew who he was. In a town this small, news traveled faster than internet speeds could explain. Robert Hartley's boy, the one who'd run off to the army, was finally coming home for his father's funeral. Michael could almost hear the conversations in the diner, the speculation about whether he'd keep the farm or sell it, whether he'd stay or leave again, whether 20 years in the army had changed him, or if he was still the angry young man who'd left without looking back. The turn onto County Road 447 was muscle memory more than conscious navigation. This was the road he'd taken twice a day for 13 years of school, first on the bus, then in the 1987 Ford pickup his father had given him for his 16th birthday, the same truck that was probably still in the barn because Robert Hartley never threw anything away that might someday be useful. The familiar landmarks passed like stations of the cross in a pilgrimage Michael had never wanted to make. The Weatherby farm, where Michael had earned spending money summer of sophomore year detasseling corn. The drainage ditch where he'd wrecked his bike when he was 8 and broken his left arm. The same arm that now ended at a prosthetic hand that could crush a beer can or delicately hold an egg without breaking it, depending on the software settings. The intersection where Mary Brennan had died in a car accident senior year, the first death of someone his own age that had made mortality real in a way that all his grandfather's stories about farming accidents hadn't. And then, cresting the small rise that his child's mind had thought of as a mountain, there it was, Hartley Farm. 640 acres of prime Iowa farmland, bordered on the north by Salmon Creek, on the south by the Hendricks property, on the east by County Road 447, and on the west by the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad tracks that carried the harvest to markets global and anonymous. The heart of the property was the farmstead itself, The two-story white farmhouse built in 1923 after a tornado had destroyed the original 1878 structure. The massive red barn that had survived that same tornado and stood as a testament to 19th century engineering. The various outbuildings that served the thousand purposes of a working farm. But Michael's trained eye saw what his childhood memories hadn't: decay. The house's paint was peeling in places, suggesting deferred maintenance. The barn's roof had patches of different-colored metal where repairs had been made piecemeal rather than properly. The fence lines were overgrown with volunteer trees and invasive honeysuckle. Several outbuildings showed signs of structural failure. This was a farm that was functioning but not thriving, maintaining but not improving. Ranger's behavior changed as they turned into the driveway. The dog's casual alertness shifted to working mode, his body language suggesting he was processing threats, cataloging the environment, establishing baseline normal for this new operational area. It was behavior Michael had seen hundreds of times when entering new villages in Afghanistan, but here, on an Iowa farm, it seemed out of place, almost absurd. Except Ranger's training had saved Michael's life more than once by detecting threats that seemed absurd until they proved deadly. The driveway was gravel, the sound of tires on crushed limestone so deeply embedded in Michael's memory that it brought an unexpected wave of nostalgia. How many times had he heard that sound? Coming home from school, from dates, from football games, from everywhere that wasn't here but led back here anyway, the sound of return, whether wanted or not. He parked near the house, in the same spot where his mother's Honda Civic had sat, until she'd packed it with her belongings and driven away when Michael was 12. Sarah Hartley, née Williams, daughter of a Des Moines insurance executive, who'd thought marrying a farmer would be romantic until she'd lived through 10 Iowa winters and discovered that romance and reality rarely coexisted. She'd lasted 16 years, which Michael now realized with adult perspective was actually impressive. The farming life wasn't for everyone. It hadn't been for her, and ultimately it hadn't been for him either. The house was unlocked because of course it was. Nobody in rural Iowa locked their doors, even now, even with meth problems and property crime rates that would shock urban dwellers who romanticized rural life. The kitchen door opened with the same squeak it had possessed since Michael's earliest memories, a sound his father had always said he'd oil, but never did, as if that squeak was part of the home's essential character. The kitchen was a time capsule, preserved in amber from Michael's childhood, the same oak table where he'd eaten 18 years of meals, the same ladder-back chairs, one with a shortened leg that had to be propped with a folded magazine, the same cast-iron skillet on the stove, seasoned by 4 generations of Hartley cooking, the same coffee maker, though this was actually probably the 3rd or 4th identical replacement, because Robert believed in buying the same thing over and over rather than trying something new. But there were differences that spoke to a solitary man's decline. Dishes piled in the sink, not just from one meal, but from days of eating alone. Newspapers stacked on every surface, some dating back months. Empty prescription bottles on the counter, too many for a healthy 71-year-old man. The floor hadn't been properly cleaned in what looked like months, tracked with the kind of ground-in dirt that came from not bothering to remove boots at the door. Ranger followed Michael through the house, nose working constantly, building his mental map of the space. The dog paused at certain points, showing interest that seemed disproportionate to what should have been ordinary household smells. Near the basement door, he actually growled, low and brief, before continuing his inspection. Michael's childhood bedroom was a shrine to 2003, posters of Metallica and Godsmack on the walls. A desk covered in college recruitment materials from schools Michael had never intended to attend. Iowa State, University of Northern Iowa, Drake. The twin bed with its NASCAR comforter, embarrassing now but the height of cool when he'd been 16. Trophies from football and wrestling, sports his father had insisted on because Hartley men were athletes, even though Michael had preferred reading military history and playing strategy games on the computer his mother had bought him over his father's objections. His parents' bedroom, his father's bedroom for the last 30 years, was more disturbing. Beyond the expected detritus of an aging widower's life, there were signs of paranoia that set off Michael's intelligence training. 3 loaded handguns in the nightstand drawer, all with rounds chambered. A shotgun beside the bed, another in the closet, boxes of ammunition stacked like preparations for siege. Papers covered in his father's handwriting, talking about surveillance and them and protecting the legacy. The basement was worse. What had been a typical Iowa basement when Michael was young, canning supplies, a workbench, storage for out-of-season items, had been transformed into something between a command center and a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. One entire wall was covered with maps of the farm and surrounding area, marked with colored pins and cryptic symbols. Red X's marked several locations on the property. Dates were written next to some marks, going back to 1979, the year before Michael was born. There were notebooks, dozens of them, filled with Robert's increasingly erratic handwriting. The early ones from the 1980s were relatively coherent, talking about the burden and the family responsibility and what must be protected. But the recent ones devolved into paranoid ramblings about surveillance, about people watching the farm, about protecting secrets that were never explicitly stated. And there were photographs, hundreds of them, all focused on one area of the farm, the abandoned corn crib in the North 40, a structure that hadn't been used for its intended purpose since mechanical corn pickers had made them obsolete in the 1960s. The photos showed the building from every angle, in every season, at different times of day. Some were date-stamped from the 1980s, taken with film cameras. Others were recent, printed from a digital camera on a home printer. Michael photographed everything with his phone, his intelligence training automatic, document everything, analyze later. Ranger stayed close, occasionally growling at something only he could sense, his behavior suggesting a level of threat that seemed impossible on an Iowa farm, but which Michael had learned never to ignore. If you're as disturbed by these early revelations as we were, please take a moment to like this video and share it so others can understand how darkness can hide in the most mundane places. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because what Michael discovered next would shatter every memory of his childhood. Part 2. The Discovery. The funeral was scheduled for October 20th, giving Michael 5 days to make arrangements and prepare the family home for the influx of visitors that rural funeral customs demanded. In farm country, death brought casseroles and condolences in equal measure, and the bereaved were expected to host both with appropriate gratitude. Michael remembered this from his grandfather's funeral when he was 15. The house full of neighbors and relatives, his father moving through the crowds with stoic acceptance, while his mother served coffee and tried to keep names straight. But first, Michael needed to understand what his father had been doing in the barn when he died. The Hendersons, Jim and Betty, had found him there and had thoughtfully closed it up without disturbing anything, understanding that the son might want to see where his father had spent his last moments. They'd left a note on the kitchen table expressing condolences and offering any help needed, signed with the kind of genuine neighborly concern that still existed in rural America, despite what cable news might suggest. The barn stood against the morning sky like a monument to agricultural ambition, its gambrel roof creating that distinctive silhouette that had become synonymous with American farming. Built in 1923 from old-growth oak that would be impossibly expensive today, the barn had survived tornadoes, derechos, and the kind of straight-line winds that Iowa produced with disturbing regularity. Michael's great-grandfather had built it after the 1922 tornado that had destroyed the original barn and killed 6 horses, 2 cows, and nearly killed Michael's great-grandmother, who'd been trying to save the animals. Ranger's behavior as they approached the barn was unlike anything Michael had seen from him outside of combat situations. The dog's hackles were raised, his lips pulled back to show teeth, a continuous growl emanating from his chest. This wasn't alerting behavior, this was active threat detection. In Afghanistan, this would have meant IEDs or hidden combatants. Here, in an Iowa barn, it made no logical sense. The main doors were closed, but not locked. A hasp with no padlock, another sign of rural trust or rural decline. Michael pushed them open, the familiar groan of hinges that had needed oil since before he was born filling the air. Sunlight streamed through the doorway, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories made visible. The barn's main floor was as Michael remembered it, though more cluttered. The John Deere combine that his father had bought new in 1998 sat in its place, maintained with the devotion Robert gave to machinery, if not to houses or relationships. Various implements lined the walls: plows, discs, planters, cultivators, each representing thousands of dollars and specific agricultural purposes. The workshop area, where Michael had learned to weld and rebuild engines, was still organized with military precision, tools in their places, everything where it should be. The spot where Robert had died was obvious. Hay bales had been moved, creating a clear area near the back corner of the barn. There were scuff marks in the dirt, the kind that suggested a fall, a struggle, maybe attempts at CPR by the paramedics. A dark stain that was probably blood-marked where his head had likely hit the ground. But what had Robert been doing back here? This wasn't a work area. This was storage for old equipment that hadn't been touched in years. Ranger led Michael to the corner, his training overriding his obvious distress. The dog was pawing at the floor, whining urgently, the same behavior he'd shown when detecting weapons caches in Afghan compounds. Michael trusted that instinct absolutely. He began moving the old equipment. A broken corn sheller from the 1940s, wooden crates that had probably contained parts for machines long scrapped, layers of agricultural archaeology. Beneath it all, he found flooring that didn't match. The barn's original floor was dirt over limestone, packed hard by a century of use. But this section was wooden planks, carefully fitted but not professionally installed. They'd been added later, probably decades ago based on the weathering, but they didn't belong. Michael used a pry bar from the workshop to lift the first plank. It came up easily, revealing not dirt, but a ladder descending into darkness. Not a root cellar. Those were common in old barns, used for storing vegetables and canned goods. This was something else, something deliberately constructed and deliberately hidden. The tactical flashlight on Michael's belt. He never went anywhere without basic equipment, a habit that 20 years of be prepared or be dead had ingrained. Illuminated concrete walls descending about 12 feet. Professional construction, not farmer DIY. Someone with experience had built this. "Stay," Michael commanded Ranger, though the dog whined in protest. Michael didn't want him following into an unknown space that might be unstable or contaminated with agricultural chemicals or God knew what else. The ladder was sturdy, steel rungs set into concrete, able to support significant weight. At the bottom, Michael found himself in a concrete chamber approximately 15 feet square. The walls were lined with metal shelving units, military surplus from the look of them, each holding bankers' boxes labeled with dates. The oldest visible date was 1979, the newest 2023. Michael pulled out the nearest box, dated 1987. Inside were photographs, but not the kind he'd expected. Not family photos or farm documentation. These were surveillance photographs of children, taken with a telephoto lens from distance. Children at the school bus stop that was visible from the farm's eastern boundary. Children at Millerville Elementary School's playground. Children at the county fair, the swimming pool, various locations around the county. His hands trembling, Michael recognized some faces. the Morrison twins from his third-grade class, Jenny Palmer, who'd been his first crush in fifth grade, Tommy Brennan, his best friend from middle school before the Brennans moved to Des Moines. They were all here, documented, catalogued. Each photo had notes on the back in his father's precise handwriting. Names, ages, addresses, parents' names, schedules, habits, vulnerabilities. Jenny Palmer, age 11, walks home alone on Tuesdays when mother works late. Morrison twins, unsupervised after school until 5 p.m. Tommy Brennan, father travels for business monthly. Another box, 1993. More photos, more children, more documentation. But this box also contained objects. A child's bracelet, a small shoe, a hair ribbon, trophies. The word came unbidden, bringing with it a wave of nausea that had Michael grabbing the ladder for support. Box after box revealed the same pattern. 43 years of surveillance, of stalking, of... What? The evidence suggested the worst. But Michael's mind rebelled against the conclusion. This was his father, Robert Hartley, who taught him to ride a bike, who cheered at every football game, who'd been respected in the community, who'd served on the school board and church council. This couldn't be what it looked like. But then he found the box from 1985, when Michael was 7 years old. Among the photos of other children were pictures of Michael's own friends during sleepovers at the farm. David Chen asleep in Michael's room, Bobby Martinez swimming in the pond, Jennifer Anderson on the tire swing Robert had hung from the massive oak tree. Michael's childhood friends, documented like specimens, like potential victims. The implications crashed over Michael in waves. Had his father used him as bait? Had his friendships been weaponized? Had children been in danger because they'd made the mistake of being kind to the farmer's son? Behind the shelving units, Michael found another door, steel, with a lock that had been left open. His flashlight illuminated a larger chamber beyond, maybe 20 by 30 feet. And here, the nightmare became undeniable reality. Chains anchored to the walls at heights that would restrain a standing child or sitting adult. A stained mattress in one corner, a bucket in another, scratch marks on the concrete walls, some looking like tally marks counting days, others that might have been words or names worn away by time, a drain in the floor that suggested easy cleanup. This wasn't preparation or fantasy. This was a room that had been used. Michael stumbled back to the ladder, his training the only thing keeping him functional. His body was on autopilot, documenting everything with his phone, even as his mind screamed denials. Outside, he fell to his knees beside Ranger, vomiting into the dirt where he'd played as a child, where his father had taught him to throw a baseball, where 4 generations of Hartleys had built their American dream on Iowa soil. When he could function again, Michael did what his intelligence training demanded. He gathered evidence. Every box, every photo, every object was documented. And in a locked filing cabinet in the corner of the first chamber, he found the worst evidence of all, his father's journals. Robert's journals began in 1979, the year before he inherited the farm after Michael's grandfather died, in what everyone had called a farming accident, but which the journals suggested might have been murder. The early entries were vague, talking about the family burden and the responsibility passed down and what grandfather taught me. But after 1980, they became explicit. The first victim had been in 1981, a runaway from Chicago, picked up hitchhiking on Interstate 80, kept for 3 weeks in the underground room, then released. Robert's euphemism that Michael understood meant murdered. The body had been processed through the farm's equipment and scattered in the fields as fertilizer. The journal documented everything with military precision that made Michael recognize his father's army training from Vietnam being applied to something monstrous. Dates, times, methods, disposal sites. 43 victims over 42 years, though Robert suggested there had been more before he took over, that this was a family tradition, going back generations. Most victims were runaways or homeless youth, people whose disappearances wouldn't be investigated aggressively. But some were local children who'd been listed as missing. The Brennan boy in 1989, not drowned in the creek as everyone believed, but kept in the room for 2 months before being killed. The Martinez girl in 1996, not a runaway, but buried in the North 40 after 6 weeks of captivity. 3 foster kids from the Johnson farm in 2004, not escaped, but murdered, and their bodies destroyed. And then Michael found the entry that destroyed him completely. July 15th, 2005. 2 years after Michael had joined the army, Michael's friend Jake Patterson came by looking for him, not knowing he'd deployed. Such a perfect specimen, trusting, vulnerable, that damaged quality that makes them easy to manipulate. I'd watched him for years when he visited Michael, wanted him, but couldn't risk it while Michael was here. But now Michael is gone, will probably die in Iraq like soldiers do, and Jake is alone, depressed about his friend leaving, easy to convince to stay for dinner, easier to drug, easiest to lead to the room. He lasted 6 weeks, stronger than he looked, fought until the end, reminded me of Michael sometimes, that defiance. Maybe that's why I kept him longer than the others. When it was over, I scattered him in the soybean field. Good harvest that year. Jake Patterson, Michael's best friend from high school, the kid who'd helped him work on cars, who'd covered for him when he snuck out to parties, who'd been the only person Michael had told about his plan to join the army instead of taking over the farm. Jake had supposedly moved to California in 2005 to pursue acting dreams. His mother still believed he was out there somewhere, just too caught up in his new life to call home. Michael's phone had no signal in the barn, but the house had a landline and Wi-Fi. He uploaded everything to multiple cloud services, emailed copies to himself at different addresses, created redundancies that his intelligence training insisted on. Then he called the only person he could trust with this, Marcus Thompson. Marcus had been Michael's squad leader in Iraq during his first deployment, the steady NCO who'd kept Green privates alive in Fallujah. After his discharge, Marcus had joined the FBI, currently working out of the Omaha field office, close enough to reach Iowa in 3 hours. More importantly, he was someone who'd understand both the evidence and Michael's mental state. Marcus, it's Michael Hartley. I need you to come to Iowa immediately. Bring a team you trust completely. Full forensics, full tactical. Marcus, this is as bad as anything we ever found in Iraq. Worse. This is children, and it's been happening for decades, and Michael's voice broke. I'm moving now, Marcus said, all business, recognizing the tone of a soldier at the breaking point. Send me coordinates. We'll be there in 3 hours. Michael, whatever this is, you're not alone. We've got you. While waiting for the FBI, Michael continued his investigation. The house revealed more evidence, financial records showing regular large cash withdrawals that didn't match farm expenses. Medical supplies ordered online that made no sense for farming, sedatives, restraints, chemicals that could be used to drug someone. And in a hidden safe behind a false panel in Robert's closet, Michael found the worst discovery yet. More journals, going back 4 generations. The crimes hadn't started with Robert. They'd begun with Michael's great-great-grandfather, also named Michael, who'd claimed this land in 1878. His journal, written in a mixture of English and German, described how he'd developed his taste during the Civil War, how he'd chosen this isolated farmland specifically to pursue his desires. He'd passed the knowledge and the compulsion to his son, who'd passed it to his son, who'd passed it to Robert. It was a generational evil, a poisoned inheritance passed from father to son, like the deed to the land itself. Always one son was chosen, groomed, made complicit through gradual exposure until they were too deep to escape. The other children, if there were any, were kept ignorant or, in some cases, became victims themselves. Michael realized with growing horror that he'd been the chosen one for his generation. His father's attempts to teach him hunting at age 5, too young by any standard. The emphasis on secrecy, on family loyalty above all. The strange lessons about power and control, and taking what you want. The isolated trips to the abandoned corn crib that Michael had hated but been forced to endure. He'd been being groomed, and only his desperate escape to the army had saved him from becoming the fifth generation of monsters. Part 3. The Investigation. The FBI arrived in a convoy that looked surreal against the Iowa farmland. Black SUVs with government plates, an evidence van, even a mobile command unit. Marcus Thompson was first out, taking one look at Michael's face and knowing immediately that this was worse than he'd imagined. Michael looked like soldiers, look after finding mass graves, after liberating torture sites, after witnessing the worst humanity could do. "Show me," Marcus said simply. Michael led them to the barn, to the hidden chambers, to the evidence that would destroy not just his father's memory, but the entire mythology of the Hartley family as pillars of the community. The FBI forensics team took over with professional efficiency that both impressed and horrified Michael. They knew exactly what they were looking at, had seen similar setups before, understood the implications of every detail. The underground rooms were processed like the crime scenes they were. Luminol revealed blood patterns invisible to the naked eye, showing that the entire space had been used for violence repeatedly over decades. DNA samples were collected from every surface. The chains were examined for trace evidence, finding skin cells, hair, blood from multiple victims. The scratches on the walls were photographed, enhanced, revealing names and dates and pleas for help carved by desperate fingers. "This is one of the most extensive setups we've ever found," Agent Sarah Kim, the forensics lead, told Michael. "The construction alone would have taken months. This wasn't impulse. This was planned, generational infrastructure for serial crimes." Aye. But it was what they found in the rest of the barn that expanded the investigation exponentially. Hidden compartments in the walls contained more journals, more photos, and most disturbingly, VHS tapes and later digital recordings. Robert had documented his crimes in video, creating a library of horror that would provide evidence, but also traumatize everyone who had to watch them for the investigation. In the house, they found more evidence in places Michael hadn't thought to look. Vault's walls in the basement hid collections of children's clothing, sorted by size and gender. The attic contained boxes of newspaper clippings about missing children from across the Midwest, some marked with stars that the journals revealed meant successful acquisitions. The root cellar, which Michael hadn't even remembered existed, contained chemical supplies for body disposal and preservation, an entire murder kit organized with military precision. The FBI established a command post in the machine shed, bringing in more agents, more equipment, expanding the investigation as each discovery revealed new dimensions of the horror. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan the entire farm. Cadaver dogs arrived from Quantico. What had started as one agent responding to a friend's call became one of the largest FBI operations in Iowa history. The first body was found within 6 hours of starting the scan, then another, then another. By the end of the first day, 17 burial sites had been identified on the 640-acre property. The North 40, which Robert's photos had obsessively documented, contained 7 graves. The soybean field, where Robert had claimed to have scattered Jake Patterson, revealed 3 more. Every field, every woodlot, every piece of Hartley land was a potential crime scene. Michael was interviewed repeatedly, agents trying to determine what he knew, when he knew it, whether he'd participated or been a victim himself. The discovery of photos of Michael's friends in Robert's collection raised terrible questions. Had Michael been aware? Had he been complicit? Or had he been an unknowing lure, his friendships weaponized by his father? "I didn't know," Michael said during his 5th interview. Ranger pressed against his leg, providing the grounding that kept him functional. "I swear I didn't know. There were things that seemed strange, yes. The way he'd ask about my friends, want to know everything about them. The way he'd encourage sleepovers, birthday parties, anything that brought kids to the farm. But I thought he was trying to be a good father, trying to make up for my mother leaving. I never imagined. The polygraph confirmed what the agents already believed. Michael was as much a victim as anyone else, a tool used by his father, groomed for eventual participation in the family crimes, but saved by his escape to military service. The psychological evaluation was more complex, revealing layers of trauma that Michael hadn't even recognized, suppressed memories that were now making terrible sense. Dr. Sarah Martinez, an FBI psychiatrist specializing in generational trauma, worked with Michael to process what was emerging. "You were being groomed from birth," she explained. "Every interaction was designed to normalize violence, to desensitize you to suffering, to make you complicit in small ways that would lead to larger complicity. The fact that you resisted, that you found a way to escape, even without consciously understanding what you were escaping from, that's remarkable. Your psyche protected you by driving you away." The investigation exploded when they found evidence of a network. Robert hadn't been operating alone. There were letters, emails, even a hidden forum on the dark web where predators shared information, traded advice, sometimes traded victims. The network extended across the Midwest, potentially nationwide. Robert had been part of something much larger, much more organized than a single family's evil tradition. Names in the correspondence led to raids in Illinois, Missouri, Nebraska, Kansas. Each raid revealed more of the network, more victims, more families destroyed by men who'd appeared normal, respectable, pillars of their communities. The Hartley farm had been a node in a web of evil that had operated for decades, protected by isolation, respectability, and the inability of normal people to conceive of such organized malevolence. The media descended on Millerville like locusts. Every major news outlet sent reporters. The farm was surrounded by satellite trucks. Michael's high school yearbook photo was on every channel next to images of the FBI excavating graves on his family's land. The narrative was irresistible. Decorated war veteran discovers his father was a serial killer, 4 generations of evil hidden in America's heartland, a network of predators operating under everyone's noses. Michael tried to maintain anonymity, but it was impossible. His name, his face, his military record, everything about him was dissected on cable news, social media, true crime podcasts. He was either a hero for exposing the crimes or suspicious for not knowing about them sooner. The fact that he'd been deployed when many of the murders occurred helped his credibility, but conspiracy theorists still suggested he must have known something. The funeral became impossible. Michael had planned a simple service, but protesters arrived. Families of victims demanding answers, locals angry that their community's reputation was being destroyed, media trying to get photos and footage. The funeral home suggested a private cremation instead, which Michael accepted. There would be no grave for Robert Hartley, no marker, no place for anyone to mourn or desecrate. The cremation was attended only by Michael and, surprisingly, Jim Henderson, the neighbor who'd found Robert's body. "I'm not here for Bob," Jim said quietly. "I'm here for you. You shouldn't have to do this alone. Whatever your father was, you're not him. This community knows who you are, knows what you've done for our country. Don't let his evil define you." But how could it not? Michael was the son of a serial killer, grandson of a serial killer, great-grandson and great-great-grandson of serial killers. The poisoned blood that ran through their veins ran through his. The same DNA that had created monsters had created him. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw his father's eyes, his grandfather's nose, the Hartley features that had been passed down with the farm and the evil that came with it. The victim identification process was heartbreaking. DNA from the remains was matched to missing persons databases, to families who'd been searching for decades. The 17 bodies on the farm were identified one by one. Tommy Brennan, age 12, missing since 1989. His parents, now in their 70s, had never stopped believing he was alive somewhere. Maria Martinez, age 14, missing since 1996. Her mother had died 3 years ago, still waiting for her daughter to come home. Jake Patterson, age 20, missing since 2005. His mother collapsed when the FBI notified her, 20 years of hope destroyed in a moment. The 3 foster kids from 2004, Marcus Williams, 13, Deshaun Jackson, 11, and Tyler Brown, 9. The foster parents had been suspected of killing them, but never charged. They'd lived under a cloud of suspicion for 20 years, while the real killer had served on the church board with them. And more. So many more. Children and young adults whose faces had been on milk cartons, whose families had never given up hope, whose stories ended in an underground room in an Iowa barn. If you're as heartbroken and horrified by these revelations as we were, please take a moment to like this video and share it so more people understand that evil can hide behind the most trusted faces. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because what Michael did next would transform his trauma into purpose. Part 4. The Reckoning. The legal proceedings began immediately. Since the perpetrator was dead, there would be no criminal trial for Robert Hartley, but there were numerous related cases. Sheriff Dennis Morrison was arrested for obstruction of justice. Evidence showed he'd redirected investigations away from the Hartley farm in exchange for payment. Judge William Crawford was investigated for dismissing missing persons cases that were actually victims. Several other local officials were implicated in the cover-up, either through active participation or willful blindness. The network Robert had been part of unraveled slowly but thoroughly. Each arrest led to more evidence, more names, more raids. By 6 months after the initial discovery, 47 people across 12 states had been arrested. The network had operated for at least 50 years, sharing victims, techniques, and protection. They'd helped each other avoid detection, provided alibis, intimidated witnesses. It was organized evil on a scale that challenged comprehension. Michael testified in multiple trials, his military bearing and obvious trauma making him a powerful witness. Ranger was allowed to accompany him as a service dog, providing the stability that kept Michael functional through testimony that required him to relive the discovery again and again. The hardest testimony was at the trial of Sheriff Morrison, who tried to implicate Michael as a knowing participant. "You lived on that farm for 18 years, Morrison's attorney pressed. "You're asking this jury to believe you never suspected anything?" "I was a child," Michael replied, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "I trusted my father the way every child trusts their parents until given reason not to. My father made sure I never had that reason. He showed me one face and showed his victims another. That's how predators work. They're different people to different audiences. The fact that I didn't see the monster doesn't make me complicit. It makes me another kind of victim." Morrison was convicted on all counts, sentenced to life in prison. He was killed by another inmate 6 months later, a man whose daughter had been one of Robert's victims. The civil lawsuits were more complex. Families of victims sued the estate, which essentially meant suing Michael since he'd inherited everything. He didn't fight it. The farm was sold at auction, the proceeds going into a fund for the families. The $8 million the property brought wasn't nearly enough to compensate for the losses, but it was something. Michael kept nothing from the estate except Ranger and his army uniforms. Everything else, the house, the land, the equipment, the Hartley name's reputation, was gone. 4 generations of building destroyed by 4 generations of evil. The psychological toll on Michael was devastating. The trauma of combat, which had seemed overwhelming before, now felt simple compared to the trauma of discovering his entire life had been built on a foundation of murdered children. His PTSD, already severe, became crippling. Nightmares that had featured Afghan combatants now featured his father's victims. Panic attacks that had been triggered by loud noises were now triggered by children's laughter, by farm equipment, by the smell of corn and soybeans. He attempted suicide 6 months after the discovery. It was Ranger who saved him, alerting the motel manager when Michael overdosed on pills and whiskey. The dogs barking and scratching at the door brought help just in time. Michael woke up in a psychiatric ward, restrained, on suicide watch, the lowest point of a life that had seen many low points. The therapy that followed was unlike anything he'd experienced before. Dr. Martinez, who'd continued working with him, brought in specialists in generational trauma, in family annihilation, in the specific psychology of discovering you're related to evil. The work was brutal, requiring Michael to examine every memory of his childhood through the lens of what he now knew, to understand how he'd been groomed, how he'd escaped, how he could move forward. "You're trying to atone for crimes you didn't commit," Dr. Martinez observed. "You're carrying guilt for 4 generations of evil that you had no part in. Your father's sins, your grandfather's sins. They're not yours. You can't inherit guilt the way you inherit DNA." "But I do have their DNA," Michael said. "I have their faces, their hands, their blood. Every time I look in the mirror, I see them. How do I live with that?" "By choosing differently. Every day you choose to be different from them. That's not atonement, that's defiance. You're proving that genetics isn't destiny." Slowly, painfully, Michael began to rebuild. Not his life. That was gone, destroyed as thoroughly as the farm had been. But something new, something that acknowledged the horror while refusing to be defined by it. He started by reaching out to the families of victims, expecting hatred, expecting blame, prepared for violence even. Instead, he found unexpected understanding. Many of the families had researched him, knew his military record, understood that he'd been as blindsided by the revelation as they had been. Some were angry, needed someone to blame, and Michael accepted that anger as justified. But others saw him as another victim, collateral damage in Robert's decades of evil. Janet Patterson, Jake's mother, was the first to reach out directly. She asked to meet, and Michael agreed, though he was terrified of facing the mother of his best friend who'd been murdered because of that friendship. They met at a coffee shop in Des Moines, neutral ground, public enough to feel safe for both of them. "I don't blame you," she said, though tears streamed down her face. "Jake loved you. You were his best friend. He talked about you constantly, even after you left for the army. He was so proud of you, said you were brave for leaving, for choosing your own path. He never would have wanted you to carry guilt for what happened to him." "My father killed him because he was my friend," Michael said, his own tears falling. "If Jake had never met me, he'd still be alive. If Jake had never met you, he would have had a lonelier childhood," Janet replied. "You gave him friendship, acceptance, joy. Your father stole his life, but you gave him happiness before that. Don't let Robert take that away too." Other families reached out with similar messages. They formed an unexpected support group, bound by the specific trauma of being connected to Robert Hartley's crimes. Some families blamed Michael initially, but came to understand he was a victim too. Others never stopped hating him, which Michael accepted as their right. It was Tommy Brennan's sister, Sarah, who gave Michael the idea that would reshape his future. "You have skills," she said during one of their meetings. "Military intelligence, investigation, the ability to find hidden things. There are other missing children out there, other families searching. Maybe you could help them." The idea seemed impossible at first. Who would trust the son of a serial killer to find their missing children? But Sarah persisted, and others in the support group agreed. Michael's discovery of his father's crimes had shown he would expose evil, regardless of personal cost. His military training gave him skills most private investigators lacked, and Ranger had proven ability to find what was hidden. Michael established the Ranger Initiative 8 months after his father's death. It was a non-profit organization dedicated to investigating cold cases involving missing children, particularly those dismissed as runaways. Using his military intelligence training, his connections in law enforcement through the FBI investigation, and Ranger's detection abilities, they began reviewing cases that shared characteristics with Robert's victims. Vulnerable children from disrupted homes who authorities hadn't searched for aggressively. The first case came from Nebraska. 13-year-old Lily Chen had been missing for 5 years, dismissed as a runaway despite her family's insistence she would never leave voluntarily. Local police had minimal resources and had closed the case. Michael and Ranger drove to Omaha, met with the family, reviewed the evidence. Ranger's behavior at Lily's last known location was immediate and intense. He led them to an abandoned property 2 miles away, alerting to a storm cellar that had been sealed. Local police, initially skeptical, agreed to search based on Ranger's reaction. They found Lily's remains, along with evidence that led to the arrest of a neighbor who'd been considered above suspicion. The family finally had closure, and a predator was stopped. Word spread through the network of families with missing children. The son of a serial killer who'd exposed his own father was now finding other victims, solving other cases. The media attention was intense, but different now. Instead of being the serial killer's son, Michael was becoming known as the veteran who found missing children. The work was brutal on his mental health, but also therapeutic. Each case solved felt like a small payment on an unpayable debt. He couldn't bring back his father's victims, but he could find other victims, give other families closure, stop other predators. It was purpose born from trauma, meaning carved from meaninglessness. Ranger aged, but continued working until he couldn't. At 11 years old, arthritis and hip dysplasia made field work impossible. Michael retired him with full honors, the FBI presenting him with a commendation for service to law enforcement. But retirement didn't suit Ranger. Without work, without purpose, he declined rapidly. 3 months after retirement, Michael made the hardest decision of his life. He held Ranger while the veterinarian administered the final injection, whispering, "Good boy, best boy, mission complete," as the dog who'd saved him in so many ways slipped away. Ranger was buried in Colorado, far from Iowa, far from the contaminated ground of the Hartley farm. His grave marker read simply, "Ranger, he found truth in darkness." The next day, a package arrived. Inside was a German shepherd puppy 10 weeks old, with a note from the families of Robert's victims. "Ranger showed us that good can come from evil. This is Scout. May she continue Ranger's work and help you continue yours." Part 5. The Mission. Scout proved to have Ranger's instincts and more. Within a year, she was working cases. Within 2 years, she was nationally known. The Ranger initiative grew from Michael working alone to a team of investigators, all veterans, all carrying their own trauma, all committed to finding missing children. They operated on donations, never charging families, taking cases law enforcement had abandoned or lacked resources to pursue. The success rate was remarkable. In 5 years, they found 42 children. 12 were found alive, having been held captive. 30 were found dead, but their families finally had closure. Each case solved was announced not as a victory. How could finding a dead child be victory, but as a resolution, an answer to questions that had tortured families for years? Michael became an expert witness in trials involving predators, his unique perspective and trained observation skills making him valuable to prosecutors. He testified about grooming, about how predators selected victims, about the networks they created to protect themselves. His testimony helped convict dozens of predators who might otherwise have escaped justice. The farm in Iowa was now an excavation site, archaeologists and forensic anthropologists carefully removing layers of soil, finding more victims from earlier generations. The total count eventually reached 63 bodies, spanning from the 1880s to 2005. It was one of the largest serial killing sites in American history, and the only one known to have operated continuously for over a century. The land itself was eventually donated to the state, becoming a memorial park. No structures were rebuilt. Instead, native prairie grass was planted, returning the land to what it had been before the Hartleys arrived. A simple stone monument listed the names of identified victims. A visitor center built off-site told their stories, focusing on their lives rather than their deaths. Michael never returned to Iowa, couldn't bear to see the place where his childhood memories and adult horrors intersected, but he followed the memorial's development, contributed to its funding, ensured the victims were remembered as people rather than statistics. 10 years after discovering his father's crimes, Michael stood before a conference of law enforcement professionals, Scout at his feet, speaking about generational predators and how they operated. He'd become one of the world's leading experts on the subject, though it was expertise he'd never wanted. "Predators like my father don't exist in isolation," he told the audience. "They're enabled by systems that fail, communities that look away, and families that keep secrets. Every person my father killed had multiple opportunities to be saved if people had asked more questions, investigated more thoroughly, been more suspicious of a single man so interested in children. We can't bring back the dead, but we can learn from their deaths." After the speech, a young FBI agent approached. "Mr. Hartley, I'm Agent Jennifer Collins. We have a situation in Minnesota. Children disappearing from foster care over the past decade. The pattern suggests something organized. Would you and Scout be willing to consult?" Michael looked at Scout, who was already alert, already reading the mission in his posture. This was their life now. Case after case, child after child, using the skills born from trauma to prevent other traumas. "Send me the files," Michael said. "We'll leave tomorrow." The Minnesota case would lead to the discovery of a trafficking ring operating through the foster system. 17 children rescued, 12 perpetrators arrested. It would make national news, lead to reform of the foster system, save lives. But for Michael, it was just another day of work, another payment on a debt that could never be fully paid. The Hartley name, poisoned for 4 generations, was being rehabilitated through Michael's work. He'd legally changed his last name to Riley, his mother's maiden name, but everyone still knew who he was, the son of a serial killer who'd chosen to hunt predators instead of becoming one, the man who'd exposed his own father's crimes and dedicated his life to exposing others, the broken veteran who'd found purpose in the most unlikely place. At night, in whatever motel room or FBI safe house he was staying in, Michael would lie awake thinking about the strange path his life had taken. He'd joined the army to escape the farm, not knowing he was escaping much more than agricultural life. He'd survived 6 deployments only to face a worse war at home. He'd discovered that everything he'd believed about his family was a lie, that his blood was poisoned with the worst kind of evil. But he'd also discovered that blood didn't determine destiny, that skills learned in darkness could be used to bring light, that a man born to be a monster could choose to be a protector instead. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could redeem 4 generations of murder. But it was resistance, defiance, proof that cycles could be broken. Scout would curl up beside him, a warm presence in the darkness, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. Another case, another missing child, another chance to prove that Robert Hartley's son had become everything Robert Hartley had hated, a protector of the innocent, a finder of the lost, a bringer of justice. The road ahead was endless. There would always be missing children, always be predators, always be families desperate for answers. Michael would continue until he couldn't, and then Scout's successor would continue, and another after that. An unbroken line of defenders against the darkness that had birthed him, using the very skills that darkness had taught him against it. It wasn't a happy ending. There could be no happy ending to a story that began with 63 murders across 4 generations. But it was an ending with purpose, with meaning, with the possibility that enormous good could come from unfathomable evil. Michael Riley, née Hartley, would never forgive his father, would never forget the victims, would never stop seeing their faces in his nightmares. But he would also never stop searching for other victims, never stop hunting other predators, never stop proving that the son doesn't have to become the father, that genetics isn't destiny, that even the darkest family legacy can be overcome through choice, through courage, through refusing to perpetuate the cycle. Every missing child found was a small victory against Robert Hartley's legacy. Every predator exposed was proof that Michael had chosen differently. Every family given closure was evidence that good could come from evil, that truth could emerge from lies, that justice, however delayed, was possible. The Hartley farm was gone, ploughed under and returned to prairie grass, erased from the earth except for the memorial to its victims. But Michael Hartley, now Riley, remained, living proof that monsters could father heroes, that those raised in darkness could choose light, that sometimes the best person to hunt predators was someone who'd been raised by one and rejected everything they represented. As he drifted towards sleep, Scout alert beside him, Michael thought about the 63 victims buried on his family's land. They'd been found, identified, given dignity in death that they'd been denied in life. Their families knew what had happened, had answers to questions that had tortured them for decades. It wasn't justice. Justice would have been them living full lives, but it was acknowledgement, truth, the only gift Michael could give them. Tomorrow would bring another case, another search, another chance to balance the scales that could never truly be balanced. Michael would wake before dawn, as he always did, load Scout into their vehicle, and drive toward another family's nightmare, hoping to bring resolution if not peace, answers if not justice, truth if not redemption. This was his mission now, his purpose, his form of service. Not the military service he'd planned, not the farm inheritance he'd rejected, but something forged from the collision of both. Using military skills to find what had been hidden, rejecting his inheritance by exposing others like his father, serving by ensuring no family would suffer as Jake Patterson's mother had suffered, as Tommy Brennan's parents had suffered, as 63 families had suffered because of 4 generations of Hartley evil. The cycle was broken. The farm was gone. The evil was exposed. And Michael Riley, son of Robert Hartley, grandson of monsters, would spend whatever years remained to him proving that sons could choose to be different from their fathers, that blood didn't determine destiny, that even the darkest inheritance could be refused, rejected, and ultimately redeemed through opposite action. Scout sighed in her sleep, paws twitching as she dreamed of tomorrow's hunt. Michael placed his hand on her fur, drawing comfort from her warmth, her life, her partnership in this mission neither of them had chosen, but both had accepted. Together, they would continue Ranger's work, continue finding the lost, continue proving that good could come from evil if someone was brave enough to choose it, strong enough to sustain it, and broken enough to understand that sometimes the only redemption possible came from preventing others from suffering as you had suffered. The story of the Hartley farm would end not with the monsters who had stained its soil with blood, but with the son who had exposed them, rejected them, and dedicated his life to being their opposite. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was a just one. It wasn't redemption, but it was resistance. It wasn't peace, but it was purpose. And sometimes, for those born into darkness, purpose was the only light possible. And that light, however small, was enough to navigate by, enough to search by, enough to find those still lost in the darkness and bring them, finally, home. This incredible true story reminds us that evil can hide in the most trusted faces, that families can harbor secrets for generations, and that sometimes the greatest courage is choosing to be different from those who came before us. If this story moved you, please share it with others who need to understand that predators often hide in plain sight, and that one person's courage to confront family secrets can save countless lives. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell to join us for more extraordinary stories of hidden truths finally coming to light. Remember, the children who disappear aren't always runaways. The families that seem normal aren't always safe, and sometimes the only person who can stop a predator is someone who was raised by one. Thank you for joining us on this devastating journey into one of America's darkest family secrets, and the son who chose justice over blood, truth over loyalty, and salvation over succession.